So, this is going to be about the haunting of the baseball card and specifically the card of Jose Mendez here. This is the Nacionales Cigarros 1923 set. Um, this card, and there's a very similar tone in the Alejandro Ohms cards from this era in Cuban cards, which is the 1920s. Um, I really I'm going to keep it with this image though, because it really constellates what I'm talking about. This is the real importance of photography and image relics that, in coalition with text, right? Because text gives context, it gives dialogue, it gives circumstances, it allows us and provides us, especially when it's first person. I was doing some research on the Satchel Paige autobiography last night, and kind of just thinking about, right, what's the difference between getting, I was going to get the biography Satchel, or just get the autobiography in his own words, right, as it was told to the person who transcribed it. Um, we're looking at a very important topic, which is the dehumanization of black baseball players at the beginning of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century and way back into the 19th century and further. The dehumanization of black baseball players, not only in Cuba but in the United States, not only in the United States but in Cuba, and it's a historical recovery project. And I was going into this with Stan Kovaleski, and I was going into this with Lefty Grove and Ed Walsh. It's a similar principle and effect, but it's a different context, right? It's a different sphere of influence. When we were talking about those players, we were talking about white immigrants, first, second generation white immigrants, condemned to working in mines in the Rust Belt, effectively, right? And baseball for them was a way out of that. The cultivation of pitching, in particular. When we look at Jose Mendez or Alejandro Ohms, right? We're moving into a new context, which is Cuban black baseball players and the struggle for the integration of the Cuban professional leagues, the real first integration of baseball in 1900. And the struggle, not only living in this incredibly tumultuous political, social, and cultural climate of Cuba, but being black in that climate, because they were the Cuban public, right? As much as they admired these baseball players, black Cubans were still treated as second-class citizens in large part in Cuba. I don't. It's not easy to make the same kind of comparison as the United States, and one of the easiest ways to talk about that is through baseball, because they were allowed to play baseball with the quote unquote white Cubans, and they were celebrated. Right, Jose Mendez is a player, as well as Alejandro Ohms, right, Martin Dihigo. These are figures of the Cuban national legacy that were celebrated and revered, and Dihigo is a little further on into the 20th century. But Mendez and Ohms are really powerful examples of this incredibly tumultuous transitional period in the Cuban national mind. Give me a moment here. So you're really looking at Ohms he got tuberculosis. He survived tuberculosis. He dies pretty young. Jose Mendez also dies pretty young. He died at 43. And he was born during this period of intense, tumultuous uprising, as was Alejandro Ohms. Mendez was born at the end of the 1880s. So when you look at this picture, right? When you look at this photo on the card, I really I approach things from a very different perspective, I think, than a lot of people, because I look at this, and this is a moment that I don't see very often in baseball cards, where it's a very, or even in photography, right? The humanization of the condition of his spirit, right? The condition of his psychology and his emotions is so transparent and so visceral. And this is why I'm saying it's almost like the haunting of the baseball card, or the ghost of the baseball card. Um, the transparency of feeling that is given in this depiction of Mendez. It actually goes back to the Paul Dean picture that we talked about. I think that was the baseball mid-rash episode. Um, this is what's beneath history, right? So when we're exhuming history, we're not really worried about statistics. We're not really, it's almost like we're not even really worried about details, so to speak. And this is the really crucial thing. And this gets back to Jose Mendez and this concept of historical recovery. Because what we're exhuming when we're exhuming history is we're exhuming the soul and retrieving the soul. It's almost like the sort of underworld mission of Orpheus, so to speak. And it's funny, it's really funny to use that metaphor, because this takes me to Page and this idea, don't look back because something might be gaining on you. And of course, in the Orpheus myth, he looks back to make sure Eurydice is still there, and she inevitably is taken back into Hades, because he's told that he's not allowed to look back as he retrieves her from hell, right? He brings her back from hell. What he's doing there is he's exhuming a ghost. He's attempting to bring the dead back to life. So right, this is not anything in terms of that kind of metaphysics. It's to provide and restore the humanity and the dignity, right, as a global project of the retrieval of this humanity. And what it comes back to is ultimately the suffering that is denied, that is marginalized, that is dehumanized, right? And so this is obviously an ongoing political and social problem in our world today, especially in terms of people who immigrate from different countries, especially if the color of their skin is dark, right? This dehumanization has such horrible effects on the psychology and on the spirit of a human being. And when I look at this picture of Jose Mendez, there is almost a gift that's being given to us here, a gift of his ability and almost willingness to bare his soul to the camera, right? So you have these themes in the historical epilogues of time, where Mendez is compared to Walter Johnson, I believe by Ira Thomas, the Philadelphia Athletics catcher. Or Alejandro Ohms is called the Cuban Ty Cobb, right? Even these forms of reference are I don't know how to describe it. They are in a way dehumanizations, right? Because it's a way of saying you who you are or what you're doing, you are like a version of this other thing, right? You're like Walter Johnson, but maybe that's the only way people can form context, is that it's through comparative analysis, right? But when you look at the career of Jose Mendez, I mean, he may be the first real black Cuban baseball pitching star. Um, he did not ever receive the kind of recognition in the United States of America than in Cuba. Um, he's think of how to talk about this. And maybe that's the wrong approach, right? Maybe it needs to be tighter and closer to the image, right, and to the card. Um, because again, right, this is about humanity and humanity in relationship to history, and it's so easy, I think, when you're discussing these things to create like a form of cultural recourse, which is the same thing that I was just discussing, like a metaphor to encompass this person's experience, right? To maybe discuss a physical detail or discuss how they were received in a certain place or to compare them to another person or individual. Um, what the gift of this image is a direct encounter, right? It's a direct encounter. It's not just a portrait. He's gazing back into your soul with his, right? So it's a moment of incredible vulnerability that's been preserved for the camera. Um, what would we really know of Jose Mendez without something like this? I would argue very little, right? He could tell you the story of his life, like Satchel Paige did in his autobiography. And a lot of the ways that people talk about that autobiography is it's a collection, right? In so much of what Satchel Paige created as a mythos and as an imagination is the bounds between myth and history are stretched and contorted. And this is a large part of Black absurdism and Black surrealism, is that the the experience, the traumatic experience of history, as it is digested and metabolized, there is an imaginative crux that's formed there, right? Between the literal and the experience and the psychological ingestion of the experience, and then how the figure or the character of the individual is formed through that crux of trauma, right? In terms of exclusion, in terms of racial violence, in terms of being seen and objectified as less than and dehumanized. Um, it's a really important part of this. When you are having a real encounter with someone, and it made me think, it popped up in my head, it made me think of Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, when he describes this experience of when he first understands that he is black, right? That he is being seen as a black person, as he's walking on the streets of France, I believe, and there's this white woman who's walking with her child, and she he is, I forget exactly what happens, but she says something to her child about, I think, blackness or something in those regards, and pulls the child away, right? So it's this idea that he's being seen from the outside as something that is wrong or bad or violent or violating, in this highly racialized context, right? This highly violent context that's being created through this perceived extreme difference in humanity. Um, when you have this encounter, right? Because I'm having this encounter now, and you have the encounter by the nature of looking at the image. Um, it is a profound depth of suffering, struggle, experience, turmoil, and almost horror of presence that's been distilled in this image. The horror of presence for the witnessing of history for someone who is and has been lucid to it, right? So there's this quality of almost like the something prophetic about that, I think. Someone who has been witness to things that you're not going to necessarily read about, I don't think, in his the biographies that have been provided by different historical sources. And this is where, to me, I have a very visceral and radical deviation from history and historical materialism for this reason, because of the way that psychological metabolism functions, right? The experience that's being detailed whether that's statistics, whether that's historical events, does not and cannot account for the psychological metabolism of the experience of horrors, which are encounters that are never encapsulated or encompassed by a physical uh, reenactment or retelling of an experience that someone has. And so, this really, to me, when we get to photography, when we get to baseball cards, right, especially baseball cards that are photographic. But as soon as I said that, I couched it in my head with the reality that when you have baseball cards that are cartoonish or artistic, they are speaking to the psychological condition of a collective or of a community, right? Because of what we discussed in the 1939 Play Ball essay, right? So I couch it with that, but this is like the real deeper spiritual power of the photographic encapsulation. It allows for history that has been compressed and condensed into sediment, right? Literally into rock or into stone or into dirt, just by the nature of the passage of time, right? In terms of the decay and entropy of the human body, or what have you, the destruction of monuments and architecture and statues, as we discussed. The photograph, in comparison to something like a book, which again we talked about with John Milton, and the concept of the fifth essence, right? The soul being held and the object being preserved. This expands and restores historical time at the deepest level, at the level of the spirit and at the level of the soul, which is the level of the human experience. And what the gift that Mendez gives in this photograph is the total bearing of the vulnerability of the soul and the total presence therein of his humanity that we are able to then experience and actively commune with now, right? And so this is something that's deeply sacred, and it's sacred because of what it affirms and what it denies. It affirms his humanity, and it denies the myth of his lack of humanity or his dehumanization or his inhumanity, which is the story that has been and is being told, right? So when we get to this kind of substratum of experience, witnessing it and being present with it, not only in oneself but in another, right, is the sacred the sacred act, the religious act or the spiritual act. And again, just this is just the power and the beauty of baseball, in its truest form, because we get away from a lot of the time. It's easy to get caught up in the action, right, or the movement, and that's a lot of the tension that baseball continually elucidates, is that we're between two poles, right? It's the moment of high action and then the moment of complete stillness, and that's the beauty of baseball, is that it restores both and allows for both, the most fast-paced intensity of movement and then the complete and utter stillness. And this Mendez, this moment with Mendez in this picture here, is complete and utter stillness, which is the being. There's total presence. He's totally engaged with this photographic act, and through his eyes, you are given the opportunity, and he's present with the opportunity to show you who he is and how he feels. And so this kind of historical restoration act is, there's no way to, I don't know, overstate just how powerful it is, because this is really what baseball is asking of us, right? When you look at baseball history, especially when it comes to segregation and integration, especially when it comes to people who were slaves who labored in the mines. What baseball is asking of us is to restore our collective humanity. Right? That's the real historical call of baseball, beneath the game, beneath like the perceived history, the cultural narratives, right, that are being told. And in order to do so, I think it's incredibly important that we have these relics and these artifacts, especially these images. So I actually have it's a clipped, it's like a page that's cut out from Lawrence Ritter's Glory of Their Times. It's on the front of it is just a picture of Stan Kovaleski, and he signed it across his folded arms, and then on the back is actually part of his orated details of his life, where he discusses getting out of the mines, joining the semi-pro team, and then being discovered by Connie Mack. And he goes to the city, right? I told y'all about this. It's to then he's eating hot dogs alone, and his team is like, all right, you gotta come eat with us in the hotel. And then Connie Mack tells him he's gonna pitch his first major league game. You need both. And I was going to say, I would almost argue that if you were just left with one aspect, you would need the photographic portraiture encounter, which is the total presence, which is the gaze into the camera, which is the encounter with the psyche and the spirit of the individual. Because this one card here, this one photograph here, tells us more than almost all of the information that's currently available to us about Jose Mendez and his life. Because we in that sense are on the outside looking in, right? We're trying to understand. And details, right? There's something that can enhance the picture, right? But without this kind of spiritual encounter, there's a huge hole in our ability to perceive, our ability to understand, our ability to know, and our ability to humanize, and our ability to be human. So this to me is just an essential artifact because of what it says, not only about Jose Mendez and Jose Mendez's life, but he also is able to, and through this, speaks for his time, right? And so you have to wonder, and it's just quite difficult. It's quite difficult because you're piecing together these stories and these histories, particularly in an island nation like Cuba, which underwent so much political turmoil that over the 19th and the 20th centuries, that restoring these historical narratives down to the level and the substratum of the human experience is very difficult because you're already just trying to piece together the basic historical, physical, fundamental facts of events. So there's a good quote here. Mendez was the very embodiment through his name, skin tone, and Yoruba cultural heritage of the Cuban nation as represented by the ideals that led Cubans to fight for independence during his childhood. The Special Negro Leagues Committee Cooperstown's election of 2006 was likely long overdue and can be justified as a needed antidote to the sport's unforgivable racist past. But quick fixes are often prone to flaws in execution. So, an argument about his election to the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame. This This is an issue. Early life details are equally incomplete and shadowy. Nieto's Spanish language volume is mostly hagiography plus endless strings of box scores. So this is my claim, right? Details of Mendez's death are also at best quite sketchy, right? So here you go. This is the realm of myth and legend. Again, connecting this to Satchel Paige. This is so important, right? Because historical Black narratives and historical Black history is a legacy of erasure by way of institutional racism, right? So you're and just a failure, right? A failure, especially when you're looking at the turmoil of the Cuban nation. So it's so difficult to truly understand and get like a real picture, a real objective picture by any means. I mean, even in like a well-established empire, right? These narratives are corrupted by bias. So an empire being like the backlogs and institutional archives of you name it, libraries, congressional systems, whatever. So here it is, right? I mean, this is the real kind of exposure, because I think when it comes to history, it's so easy to get landlocked into those details and physical events. And when you're confronted by a moment like this, you realize it isn't so much about that, right? It's not about the stories, it's not about the history. Like the Cooperstown induction, that whole thing to me is like you're on the wrong track, right? You're looking in the wrong way to really see. It's an argument over something that's it's inessential. What's essential is this kind of encounter that's present here that Mendez gives as a gift through time, right? That is preserved in the object of the baseball card here, right? This Cigarros Nacionales Jose Mendez card. This goes back into stuff that I was saying about like ownership and things like that. Like this is a historical moment that transcends time, right? It's a spiritual breach. We're reaching through time into something eternal, which is the real communion, right? The real presence between individuals through this. This is a encounter mediated by the image or the baseball card, but we are having a real human engagement here, right? A real human interaction. And this is something that almost bypasses and springboards over and through history, because it is the allowance to get to the core and the essence and the center of being, which is the vulnerability and the total presence. So that's my real historical claim, right? That through these artifacts and through these relics, if you just tune in, right, you tune the dial a little bit, you're there. You're there. You're in the history. You're in the truth of history, because you're no longer lingering on these surface level details to try to form a construct, which only tells you about what was going on the surface anyway, right? The direct unmediated encounter of the soul is present here through the artifact. And so that's what's so important about historical restoration, and this is why it's so important that these artifacts are preserved and they are made available to the public to be understood and to be engaged with. Again, purpose of museums, purpose of archives, purpose of really conscious curation at the public level, because it's a historical restoration process and project of humanity. And through the right artifact, you're able to do that, and you can accomplish it, and you can see it, and thus you are doing this great kind of spiritual service to the history of humanity and to Jose Mendez, right, in this process. So that's what I got here. I will just say again, right, this is the power of the artifacts, especially this kind of very direct, vulnerable portraiture. I don't think you really see something like this very often. The Paul Dean photo that I pulled up is something similar, but so this here is very haunting and visceral, right? You look into his eyes, you look into the way that he engages with the camera. I was almost gonna say he wants you to experience his humanity. And to experience his humanity is to, in some ways, understand him. There's much about Jose Mendez that will always be unknowable. His internal human experience and the trials of that experience and the suffering and the joys and the elation. A lot through baseball, I can imagine, through profound mastery of the sport and the craft. But this is a call, right? This is a call. This is not a number. This is not he went here and he did this from the outside. This is a call to say, this is the metabolism of my human experience through the entire churn of my lived life, right? And meet me there, right? So that's the end of this episode. I'll catch you on the next one.